G'day, Team St Albans. Who is the greatest in the empire of heaven? A kid, the 1%. Heaven's economy is a shocker. Forget the 99% we've got in our hand right next to us. Worry about the 1%. The weak, the vulnerable, the powerless. The word for child in the ancient Greek lingo is gender neutral. Children weren't considered really as people, but instead a drain on resources until they became adults, strong enough to be useful and capable of reproduction, or at least sexually useful to men. In the Gentile world of the time, baby girls were regularly left on the rubbish tip or by the side of the highway to be eaten by dogs. They were considered almost worthless to society. That's why, given the context of Matthew 18, being asked this question by a bunch of manly young blokes who would later fight about this question, one commentator reckons Jesus took a tiny girl and put her in the middle of them all. Who is the greatest in the empire of heaven, Jesus? This tiny girl. That would have rolled a bowling ball right through their hyper-masculine worldview of physical strength, power and success. And he rolls a bowling ball right through the middle of ours too. Imagine standing there as a weathered, muscular, testosterone-filled 20-year-old man of Middle East background, and King Jesus says to you, "Truly I tell you, mate, unless you change and become like children, you'll never ever enter the empire of heaven. Whoever becomes humble, like this tiny little girl, is the greatest in the empire of heaven. Whoever welcomes one such girl welcomes me." For us, the empire of heaven is the exact opposite of the theory of evolution and its children, free market capitalism and communism, the systems that run the world. The theory of evolution states that only the fittest, strongest and smartest can and should survive, that they are the greatest, and that what isn't useful and whoever isn't useful should be discarded or destroyed. Who is the greatest in the empire of heaven? The tiny kid, the homeless and poor, the refugee and asylum seeker, the aged and the infirm, the disabled, the weak, the vulnerable, the powerless. In fact, Jesus takes their welfare so seriously, he says something we find hard to reconcile with his mercy and grace, because he talks like a Russian mafia boss. If you trip up these vulnerable people, you'd be better off taking a dive to the deepest trench in the ocean with a cement collar around your neck, because you will be accountable. So you better carve out of your life whatever needs to go so that you don't make these vulnerable people trip up and stumble. Astoundingly, there are still churches and individuals who have not moved to make children or vulnerable people safer or more welcome, despite the royal commissions we've had in this country and the parliamentary inquiries. And people still grizzle about the measures we need to take in church to make people safe and welcome. Maybe the blokes around Jesus started to sneer as he said these things, because he goes on to say, "Don't despise them. Their guardian angels are keeping one eye on them and one eye on your dad in heaven." In the book of Isaiah, angels don't dare to look at God in the face. They fly around with their wings covering their face, but the angels watching over these little ones, they see the Father face to face. He is watching what you do for them. You. No sheep left behind. Heaven's economic policy is confronting. I think too often the church preaches this passage to give people some warm and fuzzies inside that our dad in heaven leaves everything behind to come after little old me. But the question was, who is the greatest in the empire of heaven? It's not me. I've got to reshape my life to be more humble. I've got to carry out this policy of heaven's empire. I've got to do Dad's will on earth as in heaven. It is not the will of your Dad in heaven that one of these little ones should be lost. Jesus is talking about what you do and about what I do on behalf of our Dad. No sheep left behind, no kid, no vulnerable person. That's on us, the church, to effect this policy. That's why Jesus immediately goes on to give us a mud map of how we might round up the straying sheep and keep them together as far as it depends on me. He gives us a mud map for reconciliation because he knows that we will hurt each other. It's inevitable. We'll hurt each other accidentally or even intentionally. He knows that we'll disagree, squabble, fight, and generally struggle to get along together. He knows that we'll lose sight of the people most important and precious to him. He knows that we will be inclined to write each other off or cut our losses, walk away and let people go. So he says, talk it out one-on-one. If that doesn't work, talk it out with help. If that doesn't work, talk it out with the church's help. And if that doesn't work, go back to square one and start talking about the good news of Jesus. Next week, we'll see Jesus continue this little talk about who is the greatest and how no sheep is left behind, when he teaches the most horrifying things about the absolute necessity of the F word. Come back next week to find out what that's all about. Today is Father's Day, and your Dad says to you, it's not my will that any of the little ones be left behind and be lost. Amen.